Well, I was here to kick us off at the beginning of the month, and then I was at a gospel meeting and preaching in Indiana, and Matt and Jake did a great job teaching. We're back into chapter 4. Are there any questions just right off the bat from anything that you read this week, or maybe something that we haven't covered in the last couple of weeks that you want to throw out there for consideration? The guys are doing a good job teaching. So that was your opportunity. It's gone. I'm just kidding. If you have any questions at any time, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll try to get to that. So chapter 4 is getting into the conversation, if you refer back to the slippery slope, trying to figure out when and how to overlook an offense. So that first peacemaking response. How do you do that? When should you do that? Why should you do that? The verse that kind of kicks off the chapter is Proverbs 19 and verse 11, where the proverb writer says, "A man's wisdom gives him patience. It is to his glory to overlook an offense." So maybe really quick, what is the writer saying in Proverbs 19 and 11? What is he saying? Pick your battles, okay. Choose your battles. So you're like, I'm not going to fight about this now, but I will tomorrow. Is that what we're saying? No. Oh, okay. So you might gain more by overlooking than if you were to engage it. Okay, for sure. It's not all about me. Okay. I'm glad that you brought that up. So he was saying that this is not an absolute thing. You can't overlook every offense. And I would agree with that, because if you overlook every offense, you've actually slipped into peace faking and denial. Okay, so there's this balancing act, and going through the study this morning, we're trying to figure out, when is it appropriate to engage and when is it not appropriate to engage? And that when you do it well, it's actually a glory to God when you can overlook something. All right? And this is a difficult one. Usually this is a class where we kind of bog down because it's just so awkward. It's hard to sort through sometimes. Go ahead, Scott. Yeah. Yes. 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 Do you all hear that? He was saying that discretion, the word discretion in the verse is really key, and that not everything is worth a nuclear response. I agree with that. Okay, well, let's get into the material. Page 80. Top of the page, this paragraph just before define the issues. As you examine your role in a conflict, it's helpful to look for two types of fault. First, you may have an overly sensitive attitude. It's possible that you have an overly sensitive attitude, which causes you to be offended too easily by others' behavior. That's a possibility. Second, you may have contributed to the conflict through your own sinful behavior. So before you go into weighing this out, you need to think about yourself first. Get the log out of your own eye. We talked about that last week. Okay? But then once you've done that, it helps to define the issues. So what are two types of issues that he talks about in the next couple of pages? Thank you. What's a material issue? Yeah. Money, property. I'll give you an example. Yeah, tangibles, something physical, right? The first place that I preached at, so this was probably the early 2000s, there was a family that had 3 sons. And the agreement that the parents had with the boys was if they hit their 16th birthday and had maintained and straight A's, that he would buy them a Mustang. Now, he didn't say what kind of Mustang, but he would buy them a Mustang. The first son, unfortunately, did not get his Mustang. The second son did, and he was so proud of getting that Mustang, but he got it in the winter and the fall and the winter, because that's just where his birthday fell. But he was so excited. We're up in Northwest Indiana, so we got a bunch of snow. And one day he came to church on Sunday, and he was so depressed. Like, buddy, what's wrong? He's like, well, I took this back road and missed a corner and took out this guy's fence, and my brand new Mustang was not a brand new Mustang. But he ripped up some guy's fence and took a Mustang through his yard. That's a material issue. And so his dad went with his son and talked to the neighbor and said, look, we won't report this. We'll take care of the damage on our car, but we'll replace this section of fence. We'll fix your yard. That was a material issue, right? What's a personal issue? The second is personal. Material issue, personal issue. Go ahead. There's so much we could say about this one. Yeah, so the question is, what is a personal issue? No, there really wasn't a personal issue to the accident, but if you have a disagreement that is personal, what would that look like? Does that make sense? So someone said hurt feelings. That's personal, right? Yeah. 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 What I was trying to think through a second ago was, this is a generalization, right? Material issues can have personal issues attached to them. But personal issues don't always have material issues attached to them. Like, you can have a personal issue, and it's just a personal issue all day long. But eventually, material stuff might end up getting attached to it. Does that make sense? And I'm just asking. I don't know that he says in the chapter. I'm just asking. Which one hurts more? Personal. Which one's harder? Personal. Which one's messier? Personal. Like, it just is. Okay. But sorting through and trying to figure out, so what are the issues? We need to define these issues. Okay. And he gives an example of that between he and his wife, Ken and Corlette. Jump to page 82. He starts to help us think through what are the type of offenses that I can overlook. And he gives us a list of verses. So in many situations, the best way to resolve a conflict is simply to overlook the personal offenses of others. Again, he emphasized personal offenses. This approach is highly commended throughout Scripture, and there's just a string of them. So what we read at the beginning of the chapter, Proverbs 19:11, or Proverbs 17:14, starting a quarrel is like breaching a dam, so drop the matter before a dispute breaks out. Like, if you fight over this when you ought not, it's going to get messy fast. It's like a dam failing. 1 Peter 4:8, above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. Ephesians 4:2, be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love. And then both in Colossians and in Ephesians, it's basically worded the same way. Bear with each other, forgive whatever grievances you may have against each other, forgive as the Lord forgives. So, there's scriptural precedent for this concept of overlooking. And I've had classes where someone's like, I've never overlooked anything in my life. And I'm like, I can tell. Like, they've obviously never read any of these verses. Okay? So it's important to talk about this and to kind of get into some of the nitty-gritty so we can do it better. And this is really important. At the top of page 83, I have this highlighted in mine. Overlooking offenses is appropriate under two conditions. First, the offense should not have created a wall between you and the other person or caused you to feel differently toward him or her. Second, the offense should not be causing serious harm to God's reputation, to others, or to the offender. I think those are some great, great principles. So I'll give you an example, or for instance, if you're trying to imagine one. Let's say I've been sick for a while. I'm not sleeping well. I'm working like crazy. I'm exhausted, bloodshot eyes, all those kinds of things. We're in the car, and I'll be the bad guy. I snap at my kids. In that moment, is it appropriate for me to snap at my kids? Or maybe I snap at Anna. Is that appropriate? It's not appropriate. But in that moment, Anna and my kids have to make a decision as they sort through some of this. Is that a material issue or a personal? Personal, all day long. But what are some of the questions that they have to sort through in their minds based on the top of page 83? Okay. What's going on with Dad? Is this normal for Dad? Is this a habit? Is this an ongoing thing? And hopefully it's, no, this is not normal. No, this is not a habit. This is not how our family normally functions. I understand the extenuating circumstances. So in this moment, what might they be able to choose to do? Overlook it. Overlook it. Okay. Now, if it becomes a habit, let's say I snap every single time we get in the car, then what should Anna do? Yeah, honey, can we talk? And she would do a great job with that. Okay. That's one really silly little example, but that's part of what you're doing. Anna's looking at me and she's like, look, Jeremy has not severed his relationship with God. He's not lost. He's still trying to follow Jesus. I can overlook this. If God can overlook this, I can overlook it. Okay? And that's the biggest indicator, is God overlooking this right now? Because if God's overlooking, I can overlook. But if he's not, then I can't. Does that make sense? All right, let's do something really fun. This is one of my favorite chapters to teach. Turn to Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4. This is one of my favorite sections to teach. My page in Philippians 4 is just so marked up and thin, partly because of this material. Going through this material helped me think through Philippians 4 a little bit better. Okay, so let's just read the text and then talk down through it and how it applies to this concept of overlooking. Could someone please read verse 2 through verse 9? 2 through 9. Euodia. Okay. So in the past, growing up, reading through Philippians 4 and hearing Philippians 4 taught, I kind of heard it explained as like it's this little section of Proverbs where each of the verses really don't connect to each other. They're just some wise sayings toward the end of the book. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that it is tightly connected, that it's addressing a very specific scenario, and that it is a context. It's a unit of thought. Now, one of the reasons I think that, what is the setting according to verses 2 and 3? Okay, you've got a couple of sisters worshiping in the church at Philippi that have a personal issue. What's the issue? We don't know. Okay? We have no idea. All we know is that they're not getting along. They don't agree about something. It could be they don't agree about the colors in the auditorium. It could be they don't agree with worship times. It could be they don't like the same songbooks. Like, we don't know. But I've seen churches split over dumb stuff like that. Right? They're just not agreeing. And so what is Paul's instruction to them? To agree in the Lord, and then to help them with that, what does he do in verse 3? He gets somebody to help mediate. Okay, so remember our slippery slope. They're to the point where they need someone to help mediate. Possibly arbitrate, we don't know. But at least one of those two. And it's become, like, this has been read in front of the whole church. This epistle is being read in front of the whole church. And they've been called out by name. So, like, everybody knows on Sunday morning, Yodi is going to come in one side and sit down there, and Syntyche is going to come sit on that side, and they're not going to look at each other, but they're going to, like, be praising God, but not looking at each other, and it's just really awkward and sad. Okay, so the church has become aware of what's going on. Now, connecting the context and talking about the unit, you've got these sisters that are obviously at odds. They're not getting along. What is it that Paul promises in verse 7? The peace of God. Are these ladies at peace with each other? No, but is there a way for them to have the peace of God? What about the end of this section in verse 9? Practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Okay, I think we've got a unit here. You've got some ladies that are not at peace, but they're promising the peace of God and the God of peace. We've got a unit. Okay, so let's kind of think down through the instructions that he's giving here. What's the first thing that he tells these ladies to do in verse 4? How do you rejoice in the Lord when you're at odds with another person? I'm so glad I don't get along with them. That's silly. Okay. Yeah. And I think he goes into that some in the material. You know, when you're working through a conflict, conflicts are going to happen. Okay, conflicts are not inherently bad. We said that from week 1. But they're opportunities to grow to be more like Christ. They're opportunities for God to show how he can reconcile situations and change people. So I can rejoice that God is working even in this. Is God happy with conflicts? No. But is God happy with the fruit that can come when people respond well? Yes. So I can rejoice in that. All right? What about verse 5? What does he tell them to do? Craig? Great. Yeah. Yep. Very good. Any other English versions out there, like everyone's reading from an English version, any other different versions out there that translate reasonableness? Gentleness, forbearing. There are a couple that say gentle spirit. Another one, this is probably a paraphrase Bible, says big-heartedness. But I think when you see all those synonyms, you kind of get a picture in your mind, which is kind of like what Craig is describing. You've got somebody that's not going to be harsh, they're not going to be quick, they're not going to come down on you. They're being slow to figure it out. Now, they may have to be firm in their final response, but that firmness is based off of careful conversation and asking questions. Now, let's add to that, though. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. Yeah. And I think that's speaking to reputation. Like, have you ever known somebody where their reputation is just like, that guy goes like this? Yeah. 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 I'm so glad you brought that up. Like, we communicate with more than just our mouth. we communicate with our body language and even our proximity to each other. So if you've got two guys that are hot, they're angry, and they're arguing over something, doesn't matter what it's about, and they're not handling it well, what do the two guys do? They rear up, and they get close, and they lean in, and they're like up in each other's faces, and like you don't even have to hear the words. You could be watching it, and you know this is not going to go well. Like that is not a gentle spirit, is it? So even when you're communicating with somebody, make sure that your reasonableness is in your body language too. Okay? But the idea is that's your reputation. Like when someone is watching this, they can tell who's being gentle and who's not. Okay? Now, what's the reason? What's the motive behind that gentleness in verse 5? Okay, the Lord is at hand. And what are some ideas about that? The Lord is coming. What else? Okay, that's true. I'm going to throw one out there. I haven't heard it yet. So one idea is the Lord is at hand. Okay, he's coming back. And if Jesus is coming back, we're talking final judgment stuff. So make sure that you respond in a way that prepares you for being judged. Okay, that's one idea. Another idea is if the Lord is at hand, where is he in proximity? He's right there. Yeah. 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 And if you read commentaries, they go one of those two ways. Either Jesus is coming back, and so we need to be living in a way that it's going to be good for us when he comes back, or Jesus is with us in this moment, and we need to behave in a way that acknowledges that Jesus is with us in this moment. So, like, think about passages at the end of Matthew when Jesus promises the disciples, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." In some sense, Jesus is with his people. Or you read through the book of Acts, and Luke explains at the beginning of Acts that he's continuing to write what Jesus is doing and teaching through the book of Acts. And so as they're trying to select an apostle replacement for Judas, who do they pray to about that? Who made the selection? Jesus. Jesus made the selection. Okay. Whose name are they calling on as they heal people? Jesus. Okay. So amongst our people, I think that there is a little bit of hesitation to acknowledge the presence of Jesus in our daily life. And if maybe we did that a little bit better, we might be a little bit more thoughtful and mindful of that. That might be really helpful for us as we try to live the way we ought to live. So here in this context, I think either one applies. I can't say for certainty which one it is. You pick. Okay? I think they're both right. I personally lean toward, I think it's describing the presence of Jesus in the moment. And since Jesus is present with you, be gentle like he'd be gentle. So the first is rejoice in the Lord. The second is let your reasonableness or your gentleness be known. Let's put 6 and 7 together. Instead of being anxious, what should I do? What's that? Okay, I hear thankful. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. He's telling these two ladies that they need to be praying. You think that's new news to them? I don't think that's new news. But I think the type of prayer that he specifies is helpful in their situation. What's the type of prayer they're supposed to be offering? Thanksgiving. What does thankful prayer have to do with my anxiety? Okay, elaborate on that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, yeah. I agree with that. I think there's even more though. Dan? Mm, mm, yeah, yeah. So you're saying that prayer, when you pray that kind of way, that prayer helps change you. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I agree with that. I'd like to chase that down in a little bit more detail. Okay. So, the word here for anxious, there are a couple of different words for anxious in the New Testament. So over in Matthew chapter 6, when it's talking about be anxious for nothing, okay? That word for anxiety is talking about being of two minds, where you're like, I've got this, and I've got this worry, and I've got this worry, and I'm not sure, and I'm not, and your mind is just everywhere. Okay? That's the word for anxious in Matthew 6. The word for anxiety here is the idea of being burdened, of being weighted down. And the context is these two ladies that are at odds with each other. So let's kind of think through a scenario. You know, you're home, you're watching these two ladies, and one of them is at the kitchen sink, and she's doing her dishes, but like this is just all over her mind. It's always there that she's at odds with her sister. But she's not talking with her really well. She's focusing on whatever the situation was that hurt. And if she's like us, you're sitting at that sink, what does your brain start doing as you think about this lady? Okay, someone's laughing and being really honest. That low down, good for nothing. She does this and she does that, and I'll never be friends with her again. I can't, I'm just so justified. And that's what you're doing, okay? Which doesn't help. It just kind of increases the burden, but that's what you're doing inside your head, okay? So Paul is saying when you're in that moment, you've got that kind of burden going on, you're feeling that, you're thinking that, then you're supposed to replace that with grateful prayer. So let's think through the mechanics of gratitude for a second. In order for you to be grateful, what are you doing? What are you remembering? What blessings? Okay, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. I'm going to make you guys work for it this morning. Okay. Okay. True. That's true. I'm going to simplify it for you guys. All right. Grayson's birthday is today. It's today. He turns 10 today. And we did a little thing with some friends up in a state park yesterday, and he really wanted to have his birthday dessert with Keenan before Keenan goes back to school. So Anna made a couple of apple pies. She made some pies, and we got them out, and we sang, and then all these people like devoured these apple pies. Guess what Grayson said as he was eating his pie? What did he tell his mom? Thank you. What was he saying thank you for? He just randomly goes around and tells people thank you because he likes to say thank you. What is he saying thank you for? what his mom had done for him. He was looking back in the past, and he didn't know that Anna stayed up until past 1 a.m. to make sure we had 2 freshly baked apple pies. But he knew that his mom had sacrificed and done something for him at his request. So he's looking back and saying, this is what my mother has done, and because mom did that, I have gratitude for her. So for you to give thankful prayer to God, you've got to look back in the past and recall moments where God has intervened and done things. It could be you're just grateful for the blessings that you have because of what he did in Jesus. But if you got even more specific, are there other conflicts in your life that God has helped you work through and resolve? Where you're like, I don't know about this right now, but eventually that got resolved. And if you look back, if you keep looking back and going, well, this was hard, but God took care of that. And this was hard, but God took care of that. And this was hard, and God took care of that. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Then when you're done with that process of being grateful, and you come to, I'm standing at the sink, well, what is God probably going to do with this one too? What has that done with your anxiety and your burden? Okay. I think the principle here in verses 6 and 7 is replace anxiety with grateful prayer. Replace anxiety with grateful prayer. And when you do that, the promise is that the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Like, we still don't know how God is going to resolve it. There are certain things we just don't know. But I'm confident, since God acted here, 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 and here, I'm confident that God's going to act here. I just don't know how yet. Does that make sense? I love that. I love it because I need it. And it doesn't just apply to when you're at odds with people. It applies to when you're living through life in an uncertain circumstance and you just don't know, but you can look back and go, well, God did this here, 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 and here. Right? Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Mhm. Yeah. 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 So I'd say this. I'd say this. You go and tell them, hey, I'm going through this great Bible class on how to work through conflict. And I've got some great material I'd like to share with you. Can I share that with you? You know? There's even an audio version of it. They can listen to it if they don't want to read it. And another big thing, I'm not making any assumptions, okay, but your application is fantastic. And I want to make sure we keep the main thing, right? The main thing as we go through this material is all of these instructions are being written to forgiven people. These are people who have made their relationship with God primary. They're at peace with God first. And being at peace with God first is helping them to learn how to live at peace with others. And so we want to help people get right with the Lord so that they can better be right with each other. I wasn't going to make any assumptions. Okay. All right. Let's try to finish out Philippians here, okay? So verse 7, we talked about that. Verse 8, growing up, I always understood verse 8 to apply to garbage in, garbage out. Like what I read and watch and listen to, that has an influence on my brain. I think that is a true principle. I think there are other passages that talk about that. I do not think that's what this verse is talking about anymore. Okay? So before we reread verse 8, let's go back to the kitchen sink, and you're sitting there, and if you're not in the right mindset, as you think about that person, what do you start to think about? All the negative. Like in your scenario, who's the villain? Oh, they are. They're like Hitler's second cousin, right? That's how you portray them. Now, think about that and then come to verse 8. We're still in the context of working through our differences. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, and I'm going to add a little bit in here, whatever is true about that person, whatever is honorable about that person, whatever is just about that person, whatever is pure about that person, whatever is lovely about that person, whatever is commendable about that person, if there is any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think on these things. Does that put a new spin on it? Because typically what I do, when I think about that person, I think about the negatives, and I tend to only see them in the negative, and I kind of exaggerate the negative to where I do think they're like Hitler's second cousin. But that's not true, and that's not honest, and that's not a complete picture. Like, the truth is, they probably do have some good qualities. You used to be friends with them. You used to get along and work together in the Lord, so there's something good there. And think about in the context of a marriage relationship, where you get two spouses far enough down the road, and they're like, man, this is the most wicked man I've ever married. Well, is that what you thought when you put a ring on it? He's my Prince Charming. There's that portrait that you've created is probably not accurate. And so what Paul is telling us to do is to see things as they really are. See things as they really are. And that takes work. And that takes humility. And you might need a trusted, unbiased person to help you with that, who's not so emotionally wound up in the personal dispute. Where you're like, man, this person is so rah, rah. And they're like, hey, I get why you used to think that. But the truth is, remember when they did this, they're probably not that bad. And you need somebody to whisper in your ear that way. Okay, what's the point of the last verse, verse 9? What you've learned and received and heard and seen in me, do it. Do it. Think back to how the Philippian church got started back in Acts chapter 16. Was it a couple of guys that are like, hey, I think there's great potential for a church in Philippi. Let's get a couple families together and do a church plant among these great people that just need Jesus. And then, boom, there's this beautiful church. How'd it go down when Paul got to Philippi? Who did he convert first? Lydia and her household. And then he cast the demon out of a little girl, and the owners don't like that, and they get him and Silas thrown in the clink, and they end up converting the Philippian jailer, and the magistrates freak out when they realize they've arrested a Roman citizen, and Paul's like, well, I'm not walking out of here. You're escorting me out of here, sir. And so, the church got started with him getting arrested. Does Paul know, and do the Philippians know what it looks like to be at odds and have conflict? Right off the bat. And so it's really easy for Paul to say, hey, you saw how I did it. Follow my example. Okay? It's not enough, and this is just true of Christianity, right? Like all of our Bible classes, we have these Bible classes every Sunday, every Wednesday. And there are times we go over facts. We memorize missionary routes and Acts. We try to memorize names and the books of the Bible and how they sort and all this stuff. But Christianity is not an academic exercise. Like at the end of the day, we're supposed to be leaving here equipped to better practice our faith. So Paul is saying, what you've learned, what you've watched, what you've seen, get out there and do it. And he's applying that specifically to this disagreement. Any questions down through verse 9? Yes. That could mean several things. Yeah. Yes. And she might not have ever responded. She might not have even changed anything. But God's changing you, and you can rejoice in that. That takes us back to the very first point, right? And this is just a sliver of some of the responses that are appropriate. Please don't leave this class thinking that overlooking is what we have to do all the time and that's all we do. That's not true. There may be times where you need to interact and address it, where you can't just forgive them on your own, because that's what we're talking about. You forgive them on your own, and you don't even have to bring it up. I'm exhausted and hangry, and I snap. And Anna's like, I'm not going to, Jeremy, you need to repent right now and ask for forgiveness. She doesn't even do it. She just forgives me on the spot because she's overlooking. She's not going to bring it up later because she's overlooking. But if it becomes habitual and it's a big problem and she thinks it's damaging my relationship with Jesus, then she's going to talk to me about it. Okay, so I want to balance the conversation, help you see there are more appropriate responses. We're just getting started. But these principles can be applied throughout. Dan and then Anna. Yeah. 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 Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Very good, Anna. Thank you for that. A couple of things I want to make sure we hit that are going to help us evaluate when we should or shouldn't do this. Page 90, counting the cost. We need to count the cost. If I overlook this and this continues to go in the direction it's going, what's the cost? So over in Hebrews, the Hebrew writer talks about a root of bitterness that defiles many. Like if you leave something unresolved that really ought to be resolved, if you let that go, it is going to blow your church apart. It is going to blow your family apart. And that is just what God's word says, and God is right. Okay? So we need to count the cost as we evaluate this moment. Like if I let this go, could it potentially become that? If so, we're taking care of it. I can't overlook it. If you overlook it, you're actually sinning. And if you try to cover it up, you're actually sinning. Okay? What about your rights on page 92? You may be in the right. Like you legally may have some rights. But that doesn't mean it's morally appropriate to exercise your rights. So think through that. There may be some rights that you give up because it's in the best interest of the other person and you're sacrificing for them. Okay, so just because you have the legal right doesn't mean you ought to press it. And he gives a list of biblical men and women that sacrifice their rights. So he talks about Abraham, Joseph, David, Paul, Jesus, all of these people that gave up the rights that they could have clung to. And some questions to ask on page 94 are really helpful. Will exercising my rights honor God by showing the power of the gospel in my life? We need to ask ourselves that. Will exercising my rights advance God's kingdom? Or will it advance only my interests at the expense of his kingdom? Will exercising my rights benefit others? Or is exercising my rights essential for my own well-being? There are more principles in there that you can go to. We've got kids coming. Thank you guys for class. Thank you so much for your participation. It was fantastic. I probably will not be in town this Sunday, but one of the other guys is teaching. So be prepared for chapter 5.